time and evidence caught up with a killer today. The cold case mystery of who killed teenager Carla Walker in Fort Worth ended, and it happened suddenly.
The man who killed her was interviewed by police 4 days after she vanished. They let him walk. For 46 years, Glenn Samuel McCurley lived an ordinary life in Fort Worth, Texas, working, aging, blending into the background of a city that never forgot the name Carla Walker. The detectives who questioned him in 1974 had no tools to see what was invisible then. No database, no genetic map, just a hunch and a degraded sample too small to process. Carla Walker was 17 when she was ripped from a bowling alley parking lot on Valentine's weekend. Her boyfriend was left unconscious in a pool of his own blood. 3 days later, her body was found in a culvert. And for nearly half a century, the question remained the same. Who took her? The answer was hiding in a family tree no one knew existed. This is the story of how silence was broken, not by a witness, not by a confession, but by the invisible architecture of DNA that connected a dead girl to a man who thought he was safe. This is Cold Trail. If cases like this are why you're here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Cold Trail documents fully sourced cases from verified court records and law enforcement files. What comes next changes everything. Carla Jan Walker was 17 years old in February of 1974. She lived in Fort Worth, Texas, with her family, a city girl in the middle of her senior year at Western Hills High School. She had a boyfriend. She had plans. She was weeks away from 18, standing at the edge of adulthood with no reason to believe she wouldn't make it there. February 17, 1974, was a Sunday. The Valentine's Day dance had been held the night before at the Ridgely Country Club, and Carla had gone with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. After the dance ended, they drove to a nearby bowling alley on South University Drive. A routine teenagers followed when they wanted a few more minutes together before curfew. They sat in his car in the parking lot, talking, laughing, ordinary. What my research discovered was that the attack came without warning. A man appeared at the driver's side window. He was holding a gun. Rodney was pistol-whipped before he could react, struck hard enough to fracture his skull and leave him bleeding and unconscious in the front seat. Carla screamed. She fought. Witnesses would later describe hearing the struggle, but by the time anyone understood what was happening, she was gone, dragged from the car, forced into another vehicle, vanished into the Texas night while her boyfriend lay motionless and bleeding just feet away. The last confirmed sighting of Carla Walker alive was in that parking lot, under the lights of a bowling alley, on a night that should have ended with nothing more than a goodnight kiss and a drive home. She was wearing the clothes from the dance. She was 17 years old, and she never made it home. 3 days later, on February 20th, 1974, Carla Walker's body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, roughly 10 miles from where she was taken. A passing motorist spotted her remains in the drainage ditch. She had been beaten, raped, strangled. The medical examiner's report documented injuries consistent with a prolonged and violent assault before her death. What my research discovered was that investigators did collect evidence, including biological samples from Carla's clothing and body. But 1974 forensic science had no ability to process degraded or trace DNA. The concept of a genetic profile didn't exist yet. Blood typing was the standard, and it was crude. The samples were too small, too damaged, too limited for the technology of the time. So the evidence was cataloged, sealed, stored in a locker at the Fort Worth Police Department. Detectives worked the case hard in those first weeks. They interviewed witnesses. They canvassed the bowling alley. They questioned men who fit the description, including a local resident named Glenn Samuel McCurley, who lived near the crime scene and had no alibi. But without physical proof tying him to the murder, they had nothing to hold him on. The evidence sat in that locker, waiting, preserved in the dark while the world moved on and the science that could read it had not yet been invented. The investigation stalled within months. Detectives followed every lead they had: anonymous tips, witness statements, polygraph tests administered to persons of interest. McCurley was questioned again. He denied involvement. Without a confession or physical evidence linking him to the crime, the case began to cool. Years later, an anonymous handwritten letter arrived at the Fort Worth Police Department, hinting at knowledge of the crime. It led nowhere. The author was never identified. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, wouldn't be established until 1998, more than 2 decades after Carla's murder. Even then, the degraded samples from 1974 were too small to generate a profile uploadable to the database. The case couldn't benefit from the new technology. It remained frozen. Then the years began to move. Detectives retired. Evidence rooms were reorganized. The Walker family aged. Carla's parents passed away without answers. Her younger brother, Jim Walker, became the family's voice, writing letters to the police department, calling for updates, refusing to let her name disappear into the archives of unsolved cases. 46 years passed. The file remained open, technically active, but realistically cold. Jim Walker spent decades living in suspended grief. He was a child when his sister was killed. He grew up, got married, had children of his own, watched them graduate, get married, have children. Every milestone was a reminder of what Carla never got to experience. He never stopped asking the Fort Worth Police Department to reopen the case. And in 2019, they finally did. What changed was technology. Advancements in forensic genetic genealogy had begun solving cold cases across the country, cases just like Carla's, where traditional DNA testing had failed. The Fort Worth Police Department partnered with Othram Incorporated, a private lab specializing in extracting usable genetic profiles from degraded evidence that other labs had deemed unsalvageable. The samples from 1974 were sent to Othram's facility. Scientists worked for months to build a profile from the trace DNA on Carla's clothing. Once they had it, they uploaded the genetic markers to public genealogy databases and began constructing a family tree. Cold Trail is one of the few channels that builds every episode from verified court records and law enforcement documents. If that matters to you, subscribe. Justice took 46 years to arrive. Stay until the end. Forensic genetic genealogy works like this. The DNA from a crime scene is compared against thousands of people who have uploaded their genetic information to ancestry databases. The lab identifies distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, and builds a family tree backward through generations until branches narrow to a single suspect. In Carla Walker's case, Othram's genealogists traced the crime scene DNA through multiple family lines. They ruled out branches. They cross-referenced obituaries, birth records, census data. They mapped the tree forward in time, generation by generation, until the possibilities collapsed. What my research discovered was that the name at the end of that search was Glenn Samuel McCurley, the same man questioned by police in 1974, the same man who lived less than a mile from the bowling alley, the same man who had spent 46 years living freely in Fort Worth, working as a contractor, blending into the background of ordinary life. He was 77 years old when detectives came for him. Glenn McCurley had lived an unremarkable life. He worked. He paid taxes. He had a home, a routine, neighbors who knew him as quiet and polite. He had never been arrested for a violent crime. To everyone around him, he was just another aging man in suburban Texas. Detectives placed him under surveillance. They collected his trash. Inside, they found a discarded Coke can. The DNA on that can matched the profile from Carla Walker's clothing. When confronted, McCurley agreed to provide a voluntary swab. It confirmed what the genealogy had already proven. He was arrested on September 22, 2020. In March 2021, during his capital murder trial, Glenn Samuel McCurley pled guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in custody in 2023, 2 years after his conviction. Jim Walker was in the courtroom when the guilty plea was read. He had waited 46 years for that moment. In a press conference afterward, he said, "Carla can rest now. Our family can rest now." The case inspired the Carla Walker Act, legislation designed to allocate funding for advanced DNA testing in cold cases across Texas. Her name became a tool for justice beyond her own. Carla Jan Walker waited 46 years for this. Her family waited 46 years for this. Cold Trail will keep documenting every case until every name has an answer. Subscribe. Share this. Her story deserves to be heard.